Dear learners, welcome back to the module number 4 of this particular MOOC, which has been named Identity, Stereotypes and Media Narratives. And this is the last unit of this module, unit number 16, which is Media and Feminism, Contexts and Consequences. The relationship between media and feminism represents one of the most dynamic and contested areas in contemporary communication studies. Media institutions have historically played a dual role. They have been both instruments of gender oppression and platforms for feminist resistance. Understanding this complex relationship requires examining the evolution of feminist thoughts, the ways media systems have represented or misrepresented women, and the transformative potential of new communication technologies. So, in this particular lecture, we will try to explore the intersection of media and feminism, tracing the historical contexts of feminist movements and analyzing the consequences of media representations for gender equality. Now, let us have a look at the feminist movements. Feminist movements emerged from the recognition that women as a group experienced systematic oppression based on their gender. While women have resisted patriarchal structures throughout history, organized feminist movements gained momentum in the 19th century when women began collectively challenging legal, political, and social inequalities. At its core, feminism advocates for the political, economic, and social equality of all genders. However, feminism is not monolithic. It encompasses diverse philosophies, strategies, and priorities. Liberal feminism focuses on achieving equality through legal reforms and equal opportunities within the existing structures. Radical feminism examines the root causes of women's oppression in the patriarchal systems and seeks fundamental social transformation. Socialist and Marxist feminism connects gender oppression to capitalist economic systems, arguing that true liberation requires dismantling both patriarchy and class exploitation. Then intersectional feminism, which is a framework developed by scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, it recognizes that gender oppression intersects with other forms of discrimination which are based on race, class, sexuality, disability, and other identities. The goals of feminist movements have evolved over time but consistently include challenging gender stereotypes, ending violence against women, ensuring reproductive rights, achieving economic justice, and transforming the cultural attitudes that perpetuate inequality. Media has been central to these struggles. It serves as both a target of feminist critique and a tool for feminist activism. Now, what is the difference between feminist and women movements? While the terms are often used interchangeably, feminist movements and women's movements represent distinct but overlapping phenomena. Understanding this distinction is crucial for analyzing how gender justice is pursued in different contexts. Women's movements are broad based mobilizations that bring women together around shared interests or concerns. These movements may focus on issues such as maternal health, education access, or welfare rights without necessarily challenging the underlying structures of gender inequality. Women's movements can be conservative, progressive, or radical in their orientation. For example, women might organize collectively to protect traditional family values or to advocate for better conditions within the existing gender roles. Now, feminist movements, by contrast, explicitly challenge gender based power hierarchies and seek to transform the social, political, and economic structures that sustain women's subordination. Feminism questions the naturalization of gender roles and advocates for dismantling patriarchal systems. While all feminist movements involve women's mobilization, not all women's movements are feminist in their analysis or goals. This distinction matters for media analysis because women's presence in media or women's collective action does not automatically constitute feminist practice. Media content that features women prominently may still reinforce traditional gender ideologies. Similarly, women journalists or media producers do not necessarily create feminist content simply by virtue of their gender identity. Feminist media practice requires conscious attention to challenging patriarchal representations and power structures. Now, let us talk about discourses on feminism. Feminist discourse encompasses the language, concepts, and frameworks through which gender inequality is understood and contested. These discourses have evolved considerably over time, reflecting changing social conditions and intellectual developments. Early feminist discourse focused primarily on legal and political rights, employing liberal democratic language of citizenship and equality. Activists argued that women's rationality and moral capacity entitled them to the same rights as men. This discourse proved powerful for achieving formal legal equality, but was critiqued for accepting male defined standards and institutions as universal norms. Later, feminist discourses challenged the public private divide, asserting that the personal is political. This reframing brought issues like domestic violence, reproductive autonomy, and unpaid care work into the realm of political concern. Feminists argued that power operates not just in formal political institutions but in intimate relationships, family structures, and cultural representations. Postmodern and post structural feminist discourses questioned the category of women itself, exploring how gender is socially constructed rather than biologically determined. These approaches examined how media and culture produce and regulate gender through repeated performances and representations. Judith Butler's concept of gender performativity, for instance, has been influential in analyzing how media creates and enforces gender norms. Contemporary feminist discourse increasingly emphasizes intersectionality, recognizing that gender oppression cannot be separated from other systems of domination. This framework acknowledges that women experience sexism differently depending on their race, class, sexuality, nationality, and other social positions. Intersectional analysis has profound implications for media studies, requiring attention to whose voices are heard, whose stories are told, and how multiple forms of marginalization operates simultaneously. Now, let us talk about the feminist waves. The wave metaphor has become a common framework for understanding feminist history, though it has significant limitations. This model typically identifies 3 or 4 distinct periods of intensified feminist activism, each with characteristic concerns and strategies. First wave feminism, spanning roughly from the mid 19th century to the early 20th century, centered on legal rights and political representation. Activists fought for property rights, access to education, and most prominently, women's suffrage. Media played a crucial role in this period, with feminists establishing newspapers and periodicals to spreading their message and counter hostile mainstream coverage. Second wave feminism emerged in the 1960s and 1970s, broadening the agenda to include workplace discrimination, reproductive rights, sexuality, family structures, and cultural representations. Second wave feminists mounted systematic critiques of media representations, documenting the absence of women in decision making roles and prevalence of sexist stereotypes in advertising, news, and entertainment. Consciousness raising groups helped women recognize shared experiences of oppression, while feminist media projects created alternative representations. Third wave feminism, developing from the 1990s onward, emphasized diversity, individual expression, and the reclamation of terms and practices which were previously deemed anti feminist. Third wave feminists embraced contradiction and ambiguity, challenging the notion of a unified women's experience. They engaged critically with the popular culture, recognizing its contradictory nature as both oppressive and potentially empowering. The rise of the internet during this period provided new platforms for feminist expression and debate. Some scholars identify a fourth wave beginning in the 2010s, characterized by digital activism, renewed attention to sexual violence and harassment, and explicit intersectional analysis. The hashtag activism of movements like Me Too and Time's Up, they exemplify fourth wave approaches using social media to challenge rape culture and demand accountability. Now let us have a look at the contexts and consequences of the waves of feminism. Each wave of feminism emerged from specific historical context and produced particular consequences for both feminist movements and broader society. Understanding this context and consequences illuminates how feminist gains have been achieved and how backlash against feminism operates. The first wave developed in the context of industrialization, expanding education and democratic reform movements. Women's increased participation in public life through reform activism and wage labor created both opportunities and contradiction that fueled demands for political rights. The achievement of women's suffrage in many countries represented a major victory, but also revealed the limitations of formal legal equality in transforming women's lives. Many first wave activists were privileged white women whose feminism often excluded or marginalized women of color or working class women or women of the lower castes or sections of the society. Second wave feminism arose during the period of social upheaval, including civil rights movements, student protests, and countercultural challenges to traditional values. Women's participation in these movements often led to frustration with sexism within progressive organizations, spurring autonomous feminist organizing. The widespread availability of birth control pills and increased women's labor force participation created new possibilities for women's lives. Second wave activism achieved significant legal reforms, including anti discrimination legislation, reproductive rights protections, and recognition of sexual harassment and marital rape. However, feminist gains prompted conservative backlash, and the movement faced criticism for centering white middle class women's concerns. Third wave feminism emerged amid neoliberal economic restructuring, the consolidation of women's legal gains, and a sense that second wave feminism has become rigid or out of touch. The consequences of third wave feminism include greater attention to intersectionality and diversity, more complex engagement with popular culture and sexuality, and the incorporation of feminist rhetoric into mainstream commercial culture. Critics argue that third wave approaches sometimes prioritized individual choice over collective political action and were vulnerable to co-optation by consumer capitalism. Fourth wave digital feminism has mobilized unprecedented numbers of people around issues of sexual violence, bringing down powerful abusers and changing public conversations about consent and harassment. Social media has enabled rapid information sharing and global solidarity, but also exposed activists to harassment and burnout. The consequences of fourth wave activism are still unfolding but include increased cultural awareness of gender issues alongside intensified anti feminist backlash. Now, let us have a quick look at the feminist communication theories. Feminist scholars have developed distinct approaches to understanding media and communication, challenging both content of mainstream media and the theories used to analyze communication processes. These feminist communication theories provide essential frameworks for studying media representations and effects. Feminist media theory emerged from critique of Images of women in advertising, film, television, and news. Early feminist media scholars documented how media routinely presented women in limited stereotypical roles as sex objects, domestic servants, or peripheral characters whose stories revolved around men. So these representations were understood not as innocent entertainment but as ideological messages that naturalized women's subordination. Feminist theories argued that media helps construct gender by repeatedly showing certain behaviors, appearances, and roles as normal and appropriate for women and men. Standpoint theory, which was developed by feminist epistemologists and adapted for communication studies, it argues that knowledge is socially situated and that marginalized groups may have clearer insights into social systems than the privileged groups. From this perspective, women and other marginalized people can offer distinctive perspectives on media systems because they experience both the dominant viewpoint and their own subordinate position. Standpoint theory has implications for who produces media content and whose perspectives are considered credible or newsworthy. Muted group theory. It originated with anthropologist Edwin Ardener and developed by communication scholars Charis Kramery and Paula Trickler. They proposes that language itself reflects the perspectives and interests of dominant groups. Women and other marginalized groups become muted because they must express their experiences through a language system that does not adequately represent their reality. So, this theory helps explain why women's concerns are often trivialized in media coverage and why feminist ideas may be difficult to articulate within mainstream media frameworks. Feminist scholars have also contributed to reception theory and audience studies, examining how actual viewers interpret and respond to media content. This research reveals that audiences are not passive recipients of media messages but active interpreters who may resist dominant ideologies. Women viewers may engage in oppositional readings of media texts criticizing sexist representations while still finding pleasure in consuming media. This work complicates simplistic models of media effects while maintaining attention to the constraints that limit interpretative freedom. Challenging the definition of theories. Feminist approaches have fundamentally challenged traditional understandings of what constitutes legitimate theory or knowledge. This challenge extends to communication theory, where feminists have questioned the claimed objectivity and universality of mainstream theoretical frameworks. Traditional communication theories often presented themselves as neutral, scientific accounts of communication processes. Feminist scholars revealed that these supposedly universal theories actually reflected particular male centered perspectives while marginalizing questions about gender and power. What counted as important research questions, which methods were considered rigorous, and whose experiences were theorized, all reflected gender biases that made women's experiences and feminist concerns seem peripheral and unscientific. Feminist theories argue that all knowledge is situated and partial, emerging from particular social locations and serving particular interests. Rather than pretending to transcend social position, feminist scholarship embraces its commitments to gender justice and acknowledges how the researcher's identity and values shape the research process. This does not mean abandoning rigor or evidence, but rather being transparent about standpoints and purposes. Feminist challenges to traditional theory have several dimensions. First, feminists expand their counts as worthy of theoretical attention, bringing previously ignored topics like domestic labor, reproductive politics, and sexual violence into the academic discourse. Secondly, feminists question dichotomies between reason and emotion, mind and body, public and private, that have structured the Western thought and marginalized concerns associated with women. Thirdly, feminists advocate for diverse research methods, including qualitative approaches, personal narrative, and participatory research that traditional scholarship dismissed as subjective or unscientific. The consequences of these challenges extend beyond feminism. By questioning claimed universality and objectivity, feminist theory opens space for other critical approaches, examining how power shapes knowledge production. Critical race theory, queer theory, post colonial theory, and disability studies all share feminist commitments to revealing how dominant perspectives masquerade as universal truth while marginalizing other ways of knowing. Now, let us talk about women, minorities, and underrepresentation. Despite decades of feminist activism and scholarship, women and gender minorities remain significantly underrepresented in media content production and decision making. This underrepresentation has profound consequences for public discourse, cultural attitudes, and democratic participation. In media content across news, entertainment, and advertising, men vastly outnumber women as subjects, sources, and protagonists. Research consistently shows that women comprise approximately 30% or less of news sources and subjects globally, with even lower representation in stories about politics, business, and international affairs. Women journalists are more likely to be assigned stories about health, education, and lifestyle rather than hard news beats. In film and television, women represent a minority of speaking characters, and those who do appear are typically younger and more conventionally attractive than their male counterparts. Women over 50 are nearly invisible in media representations. The underrepresentation extends beyond simple numbers to the types of roles and portrayals women receive. Women in media are more likely to be defined by their relationships to men than as independent agents, more likely to be sexualized than men, and more likely to face violence that is presented as entertainment rather than serious social concern. Professional women are often depicted as cold and incompetent, while women who prioritize family may be shown as fulfilled but limited. These patterns communicate messages about women's appropriate place or behavior. The situation is more severe for women who face multiple forms of marginalization. Women of color, women from the lower caste, LGBTQ women, disabled women, older women, women from non-Western cultures, they face even more extreme underrepresentation and more stereotypical portrayals when they do appear. Indigenous women, for example, are nearly invisible in mainstream media, except in relation to stereotypical tropes about tradition or victimization. Transgender women face hostile coverage that question their legitimacy while sensationalizing their bodies and experiences. Behind the camera and in management positions, women's underrepresentation is equally stark. Women directors, cinematographers, and producers remain minorities in film and television production. In news organizations, women are underrepresented in senior editorial positions and boardrooms where strategic decisions are made. This matters because who makes media content influences which stories get told, which perspectives are included, and how issues are framed. Research shows that media organizations with more women in leadership produce more diverse and comprehensive coverage of gender related issues. The consequences of this underrepresentation are significant. Media shapes public understanding of social reality, influencing which issues seem important and which voices seem credible. When women are largely absent from media or appear only in limited roles, it reinforces their marginalization in public life. Young people develop gendered understandings of their own possibilities partly through media exposure. The exclusion of women's perspectives from political and economic coverage distorts public discourse about major policy questions. Moreover, the media's failure to represent the diversity of women's lives makes it difficult to build broad based feminist movements that address varied experiences and concerns. Now, after the onslaught of digital media, what happens? Digital media technologies have fundamentally transformed the landscape of feminist media activism and representation. The rise of the internet, social media platforms, blogs, podcasts, and mobile communication has created unprecedented opportunities for feminist expression while also generating new challenges and new forms of oppression. Digital media democratizes communication by lowering barriers to content creation and distribution. Feminists no longer need access to traditional media gatekeepers to reach the audiences. Social media platforms enable rapid mobilization around feminist causes, exemplified by viral campaigns like Me Too, etc. These movements demonstrate how digital tools can amplify marginalized voices, create global solidarity, and force public attention to issues mainstream media might ignore. Digital media has been particularly important for feminists in context where traditional media is heavily controlled or hostile to the feminist perspectives. Online spaces have fostered diverse feminist communities and conversations. Blogs and social media enable feminists to develop complex analysis, share personal experiences, and engage in sustained debate about feminist priorities and strategies. Digital platforms have been crucial for the development of intersectional feminism, providing spaces where women from different backgrounds, social backgrounds, LGBTQ, feminist, disabled feminist, or other marginalized within mainstream feminism can articulate distinctive perspectives and build alternative movements. However, digital media also presents significant problems. The same platforms that enable feminist expression facilitate misogynistic harassment and abuse. Women who speak publicly online, especially women of color or when women from marginalized groups, and those addressing controversial topics face coordinated campaigns of threat, doxing, and hate speech designed to silence them. This digital violence reproduces offline patterns of male dominance while exploiting the specific features of online environments like anonymity, rapid dissemination, and permanent archives. Digital capitalism creates new forms of exploitation. Social media platforms profit from user generated content while providing minimal compensation to creators. Algorithms shape visibility in ways that often privilege sensational or conventional content over complex feminist analysis. The pressure to maintain constant online presence for professional or activist purposes creates unsustainable demands, contributing to burnout, particularly among women from different lower backgrounds who face the most severe harassment. Moreover, digital media has not eliminated traditional patterns of underrepresentation and misrepresentation. While alternative feminist media thrives online, mainstream digital platforms often reproduce sexist content on massive scale. Online advertising continues to sexualize and objectify women. Pornography, much of it depicting violence against women, is ubiquitous. Algorithm driven content recommendation can create echo chambers or rabbit holes that reinforce misogynist ideologies. The global reach of digital media raises questions about cultural imperialism and whose feminism dominates online spaces. English language Western feminist perspectives often circulate more widely, potentially marginalizing feminist movements in other contexts. Yet, digital media also enables South South dialogue and circulation of non Western feminist thought that challenges universal assumptions. Now, let us have a look at the community media, which can be a space for women. While mainstream media has often marginalized women, community media provides alternative spaces for women's expression and participation. Community media, including community radio, television, newspapers, and online platforms, operates on principles of access, participation, and service to specific communities rather than commercial profit. Community media initiatives have been particularly significant for women in contexts where mainstream media is inaccessible or hostile. Community radio stations in rural areas provide platforms for women to share information about health, agriculture, legal rights, and local governance. These stations often broadcast in local languages and address concerns relevant to women's daily lives that commercial or state media ignore. Community media enables women to participate not just as audiences but as producers, developing technical skills and public voices. Feminist community media projects explicitly center gender justice in their missions and operations. These initiatives create content that represents women's diverse experiences, challenges stereotypes, and advocates for women's rights. They also prioritize women's participation in media production and decision making, providing training and mentorship to women to develop women's communication skills. By creating supportive environments, feminist community media helps overcome the barriers women face in mainstream media organizations, including discrimination, harassment, and work cultures designed around male experiences. Community media's participatory ethos aligns with feminist values of inclusion and collective action. Rather than experts speaking on passive audiences, community media facilitates dialogues and enables communities to represent themselves. This approach recognizes community members, including women, who may lack formal education or professional training, as legitimate knowledge producers. Community media thus challenges the hierarchies of expertise that often marginalize women's experiential knowledge. The relationship between media and feminism is characterized by ongoing struggle over representation, voice, and power. Media has been a site where gender inequality is reproduced and naturalized, but also where feminist resistance emerges and alternative visions circulate. So, understanding this relationship requires attention to the historical contexts that shaped different waves of feminism, the theoretical frameworks feminists have developed for analyzing communication, and the persistent patterns of underrepresentation and misrepresentation that mark contemporary media. The digital transformation of media has created new opportunities for feminist expression and mobilization while generating new forms of misogyny and exploitation. Community media provides alternative spaces for women's participation. Through these initiatives, face significant resource and sustainability challenges. So, looking forward, feminist media activism must continue working on multiple fronts, creating alternative representations, transforming mainstream institutions, developing inclusive movements, and imagining new forms of feminist communications. So, as a learner of media and communication, engaging with feminism is not optional. Gender shapes all aspects of media production, content, and reception. So, whether analyzing news coverage, studying entertainment media, or examining audience behavior, or working in media industries, attention to gender and power is essential for adequate understanding. Moreover, given media's profound influence on social life, all who care about justice have a stake in ensuring that media systems serve rather than undermine equality. The challenges are significant, but feminist media activism over many decades demonstrates that change is possible when people commit to collective action and refuse to accept the present as inevitable. Thank you so much, and we will meet again in the next video.